Kajantiv, everyone.
Kajantiv.
There are more seats here. right by the principal. One of my closest friends when he was in rabbinical school, he, like many of us, had a pulpit for high holidays as a way of getting experience, earning some income. And one year, his pulpit was in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, like hardcore Penn State country. Lewistown, something like that. Small shul. He was brought out there for the high holidays, and he was expected to do everything. It was the middle of his Yom Kippur Yizkor sermon. Mid-sentence, a teenager runs into the room and yells, "Halftime, Penn State 21, Ohio State 14. Everybody cheered and went back to listening to the sermon. I don't know what made me think of that right now. It really is incredible that some of you are here when I think about it. Looking at you. Hey, the best team win. Listen, we do have Padres fans in the room, so I have to be careful. Where are they? Where are my Padres fans? Where are they? Okay. Fan. No, there's more than one. There's more than one. Where are the Fertels? There they are. Okay. Maybe I should do the sermon like a broadcaster. That sermon is long. That sermon is long. It is gone. It's not going to be that long. Jonah is a biblical prophet. He's got a book named after him. And the people of Nineveh in that story were rotten sinners. So if you had to side with one of them, you'd pick Jonah, right? I think wrong. Why? Because I'm a hypocrite. And you are too. All of you. I said that to one of our staff members a few weeks ago as I was mulling over the sermon, and you should have seen the look on her face when I told her she was a hypocrite. Who would not defend themselves against such an accusation? But then I continued. You are, because you have values and principles which are lofty, which you stand by, which you profess, and which you don't always live up to. Her face changed. She even took a step back. She began to get the point. There is a merit to a certain kind of hypocrisy. Yes, I'm a hypocrite. I'm not about to announce some tawdry reveal. Sorry to disappoint. But I confess to myself, and I confess to all of you and to the Holy One, that there are indeed some gaps between my professed values, my very deeply held principles, and my actions. And in those gaps, there's important work to be done. There's aspiration, maybe even holiness. Let me take a step back. On Rosh Hashanah, I tried to speak about the state of the world and the Jew within the world. Tonight, I'd like to speak about the state of the self. Where are you? Where are we all going? And what's the path? The topic was born in my mind when I was listening to a podcast this summer. Barry Weiss, who for years before she and her wife Nellie moved back to New York, were members at Temple Beth Am and would have been at this Kol Nidre service had they not moved. She was interviewing this summer Yuval Levin for her podcast, Honestly. Yuval is an Israeli-American political analyst. And it was the week after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump at a rally in Pennsylvania. And they were discussing people's reactions, including whether we should believe those who, to dip into the famous line from Casablanca, were shocked, just shocked, that the militant and divisive political discourse that they themselves had been promoting could have led to such political violence. He said we should be wary of accusing people of being duplicitous just by expressing shock and outrage, even if the day before they were contributing to the vile political climate. Everybody was, and everybody is shocked. And that's a good thing, he said. The fact that no one was saying, yes, of course, that event was the natural outcome of our rhetoric, is a good thing for us. In his words, we should allow people to back off from the abyss. I'm generally friendly to hypocrisy, he said. I think hypocrisy is a great tool of moral formation. And when Barry pushed him on that rather shocking line, he continued. Ultimately, I think one of the best ways to be a better person is to pretend to be a better person. He is valorizing and uplifting the notion of fake it until you make it. That's not just posing. That's not lazy living. That is, according to Levin, the primary way a human being actually affects change in him or herself. In his words, even if you're not living up to all your standards, to say out loud that these are your standards is important and valuable. This is counterintuitive and rather bracingly honest wisdom. It does not pretend that any of us is an angel. I mean, Otani was for a small amount of time. It doesn't pretend that any of us is sinless, so easily able to be internally and reliably consistent. We want to live in a society that has professed values worth aiming for. We are people who have work to do. If not, what's Yom Kippur for? If not to remind us of the person that we ought to be but are not yet, and give us the GPS for our spiritual and personal aspirations. In Barry's synopsis, it's better to have standards and fall short than not to have standards at all. It's better to be a striving hypocrite than live a life of perfectly self-satisfied moral mediocrity. Do you believe this idea, and do we as Jews believe it? What does our tradition say? This brings me back to Jonah and to Nineveh. In a superb chapter in her book, Subversive Sequels, Judith Klitzner compares the Jonah narrative, which we're going to read tomorrow afternoon, with the Noah narrative and the flood. She takes Noah to task a bit, and she takes God to task a bit. Why? Because that generation is deemed evil and worthy of destruction based on their deeds. And what's not mentioned at all in the Noah story? Tshuva, repentance, the chance that they might be able to actually change their ways. God doesn't mention it. Noah doesn't mention it about his neighbors. There's a philosophy of staticness in the story. How you are is how you will be. Noah is righteous, he lives. The others are rotten, they die. There's no space for growth. There's no reaching to be better. It's a very early Torah story, of course. It's a very anti-Yom Kippur story. There's no room for meaningful, productive hypocrisy. of the type that propels you through the gap between who you are now and who you know you really ought to try to be. But by the time of Jonah, much later in the Bible, there's been a change. If you think about it, what is the prophet Jonah's sin as described by the book? His sin is that he doesn't believe that the sinners of Nineveh can change. He is aghast and angry that after being sent out to herald doom upon them, he doesn't get to mete it out. Vayar Elohim et masehem ki shavu midarkam hara'ah. God saw their deeds and that they found a way to turn away from their evil ways. Vayinachem ha'Elohim v'lo asah. So God changed God's mind and did not follow through. Vayera el Yonah ra'ah gdolah. And Jonah was very upset by that. Vayichar lo. Jonah was angry. Jonah thinks God is weak for holding back the punishment because people had the audacity to try to be a little bit better. But by now, as God has evolved through our biblical texts, and God does indeed evolve in the Tanakh, God seems to believe in what I'm calling productive hypocrisy. The people of Nineveh were sinners, but they knew they were sinning. And they knew there was a version of themselves and their society that could be worthy. And they changed their ways. Isn't that hopeful? Isn't that what we want? Between Jonah and Nineveh, I choose Nineveh. Jonah actually seems existentially depressed because the people of Nineveh stretched and reached across that gap between today's imperfect behavior and today's lofty expectations. And they found a way to live better and to be better. Jonah is depressed by that. I'm inspired by that. My dear friend, Rabbi David Ingber, once studied to be a yoga instructor. He completed a course, and he felt proud. And he told a fellow practitioner of yoga, guess what? I'm a yoga instructor now. The friend was unimpressed and put him in his place. You think you're a yoga instructor because you passed a course? Practice this deep body wisdom for 20 years, and then let's talk. You are nothing yet. On the one hand, the critique was cutting, but it was accurate. David admits he had been prematurely arrogating to himself an expertise he had not yet fully achieved, and thus pride he didn't yet fully deserve. It was, if you'll excuse the phrase, a stretch. They're not all great. On the other hand, that critique deflated him, and he remembers it 25 years later. His friends saw him as static. You reach this level, but only this level. In the present tense, you're not that impressive. But what if that friend had seen and reflected back to David the incipient beginnings of something marvelous, the first steps on a lofty path? What if he had nourished the seed that might one day grow into a glorious tree? David remembers thinking to himself that day, no, you are right. I'm not a true yoga instructor. Not yet. But I might be in the future. And that's what I'm reaching towards. Was David's self-assessment rank deceptiveness? Was he presenting himself as something that he wasn't? Or was it productive hypocrisy of the type that laid out the chasm ahead of him between who he was then and who he could become? With effort, with earnest work on the self, with the very kind of work that we are supposed to be doing today. A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Robert Browning may not have had the notion of hypocrisy in his mind when he penned that line, but he was musing on something similar. Reach for something that you're not yet, but that you know you should be. And in order to recognize that a reach is needed, one must confess that one is still in formation at every age in life. Still aiming for the way of being that you know is right, but is hard and elusive. We're going to get used to words saying that very thing. Achet shechatanu. We beat our chests towards a better us. In the 1980s, the United Synagogue put out a dense pamphlet. It was called Emet ve'emunah, Truth and Faith. And it tried to lay out deeply but succinctly the principles of conservative Judaism. We studied it, and I will admit, we lampooned it a little bit at USY events. Let's say it did not become the bestseller and the cultural touchpoint hoped for by its authors, at least one of whom is a member of Temple Beth Am and a father-in-law to one of its rabbis. But at least one line of it was memorable. We quoted it in jest because of its soaring, highfalutin language. But in retrospect, that line was profound and speaks to our topic. It went like this. Complacency is the mother of stagnation and therefore the antithesis of conservative Judaism. Complacency is the mother of stagnation and therefore the antithesis of conservative Judaism. Within the theology and religious theory of our movement, the line was meant to celebrate a constantly evolving Judaism and Jewish practice. Standing still is deadly and very anti-Jewish. We are all meant to be striving Jews, reaching for the next mitzvah to perform, the next ritual to incorporate into our lives, the next thoughtful adjustment to religious life, given the historical era that we live in. We are, in a sense, constantly yogaing ourselves, contorting, stretching, reaching our fingertips out as far as we can. But the line can be applied not just to a movement, but to a person, to every person. Complacency is the mother of stagnation. And who wants to stagnate as a self? To say that you already do perfectly every ideal that you profess and embody is to prevaricate. It is to lie to yourself, and it is to lie to others. And it is to ensure that you will stay exactly where you are and exactly how you are. But to say there's a goal line out there, constantly moving, that exemplifies the person you want to be, and the spouse you know you should be, and the parent you are certain that they need you to be, and the friend that you could be, to say that is out there, and to reach towards it knowing it's a Sisyphean threshold you'll never achieve, that's productive hypocrisy. And we're all guilty of it, thank God. We should revel in it and the sanctity of the race across that chasm. There's a famous story about Franz Rosenzweig, the 18th and 19th century German Jewish philosopher. His youthful forays into the world of ideas almost drew him completely away from Judaism. He turned back towards Torah, but his path was meandering and it was fascinating. And interestingly, he's one of the few modern philosophers sort of claimed and quoted by Jewish leaders and teachers across the spectrum, from the Reform movement to Chabad to everywhere in between. Every Jew seems to find something authentic and illuminating about Rosenzweig's trajectory. He was once asked, as he was making his way back into Jewish life, he was once asked if he puts on tefillin. He had a crisp two-word answer: not yet. For that answer alone, we claim him as a conservative Jew. I see a lot of not yet tefillin wearers out there. He must have read Emet ve'emunah. In other words, he was saying, in two words, I know that a Jew is obligated to put on tefillin, and I don't deny that mitzvah or its authority or its import. I would tell other people that they should. I aim to get there myself. Someday. Productive hypocrite. Especially on Yom Kippur, our productive, stretchy hypocrisy is on full ritual and it's on sartorial display. We are all pretending today to be angels in order to reach towards the better angels of our nature, to quote Lincoln. We don't eat or drink, because angels don't. We abstain from intimacy, as angels are above that, but humans are generally not. Many of us are dressed in white and spend much of the day standing feet together, just as the prophet Ezekiel described the angels. Are we angels? Not I. Not yet. But like Yuval Levin said, one of the best ways to live more angelically is to pretend, to cosplay as an angel, to leap across the divide from you actual to you evolved, and see what sticks, and see what can endure, and what can be maintained. And think about our most iconic liturgy today, the Ashamnu. We are guilty, and the list of al-chaitz, the long list of sins. In a way, this is the inverse notion. When we recite those words and beat our chest, we are pretending, but in the opposite direction. We are taking personal responsibility for many sins for which we actually have no guilt. We are cosplaying the role of the complete sinner. Why? In order to beckon and enter a state of contrition. I haven't done all these things, but I pretend to in this prayer to awaken my penitent heart. And in the reverse, I'm not yet all these things I profess someone like me should be, but I say with pride, with a bit of productive hypocrisy, that I believe in them, and I say out loud and to anyone who's listening, I'm trying to get there. These are mirror processes, the al-chaitz and the not-yets. That we are fully sinful and we are angels. They are processes that give birth, that should give birth to meaningful change. And I believe this idea is baked into Jewish notions of behavior. And our ancient sages knew a lot about the human condition. Our tradition is very honest and not overly sentimental about how most people actually are, which is flawed, but hopefully striving, far from perfect, but able to articulate what closer to perfection looks like. A core concept of the performance of mitzvot is expressed in 5 concise Talmudic words. Mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. There's no way to match that succinctness in modern English, but it's something like this. Something that begins not being done for all the right reasons or for the sake of heaven can turn into something that is, something holy, something intentional. In other words, try a mitzvah. Put on tefillin. Start saying blessings before you eat food. Do havdalah when Shabbat is over, etc. Even if now you are not sure why you're doing it, or what the value or the meaning is, just try. Lean in. Stretch. Just act like a more observant and a more careful Jew. Just act like a more attentive and affectionate spouse. Just act like a more available and compassionate friend. And who knows? You might become the very Jew, the very person you were acting like. So Jonah is no hero to me today. The penitent but accessible sinners of Nineveh are more so. I think Jonah was wrong. And I also think that George Bernard Shaw was wrong. And I sensed that all the way back in 10th grade. My school had an annual essay contest. I even remember the name of it. It was called the Baldwin Prize. You went into a large auditorium, you took your seat, and in front of you was a piece of paper with a quote you had never seen before. And you had 1 hour to write an essay in response to that quote. In 10th grade, the quote that I faced was one that belonged to George Bernard Shaw. And I remember it verbatim, even though I don't think I've confronted it since that day. He wrote, "I fear that we must make the world honest before we can honestly say to our children that honesty is the best policy." He was arguing for consistency, I get it, and against hypocrisy. How can we preach honesty to our children if we don't yet deliver it all the time? Isn't that hypocritical? My 10th grade brain bristled at this. I remember writing, unknowingly presaging Yuval Levin 36 years later, that I thought the best and only way to make the world honest in the future is to tell our children that honesty is the best policy now. Even if our commitment to honesty is not perfect, we know it should be. Tell them that. Push them towards that. Inspire them to reach towards that, towards the angels. That's not hypocrisy, or at least not the problematic version of it. That's learning how to fly, even when your wings are new. We're all hypocrites, or at least I hope we are, with reaches beyond our grasp, directing us forward and upward. We're not sociopathic or Machiavellian, intentionally deceptive hypocrites, or at least I hope we are not. We're not misleading people, but I'd like for us to be people of moral imagination, with images of who we ought to be, an image that is always at least a little bit beyond what we currently are. So this year, be a hypocrite. Live with a dream rather than static spiritual death. Name all the wonderful things you already are and be proud of them. And imagine all the things you are not yet and live into them. And who knows who you may be by next year. Shabbat shalom.